I never should have followed my dreams. That's what I keep telling myself now. It started 3 months ago. I'd been working too hard at my accounting job in Chicago, barely sleeping, living on coffee and takeout. My therapist suggested I needed a real vacation, somewhere peaceful to reset my mind. That night, I had the dream for the first time. In the dream, I was standing on a wooden dock. The water of the lake stretched out before me, perfectly still, reflecting the pine trees that surrounded it like a mirror. Behind me stood a cabin. Nothing fancy, just a simple 2-story structure with wide windows and a wraparound porch. Something about it felt right, peaceful, like I'd found a place where I could finally breathe again. I had the same dream 5 nights in a row. Each time I saw more details: the faded blue paint on the shutters, the stone path leading from the dock to the cabin's front door, the way sunlight filtered through the trees at dusk. It felt more like a memory than a dream. On the 6th day, driven by curiosity I couldn't explain, I searched online. Lakeside cabin, blue shutters, pine trees. Hundreds of images appeared, but I scrolled through them almost in a trance until I saw it. My cabin. The exact one from my dreams, down to the crooked weather vane on top of the roof. The listing called it Pinewood Retreat, a vacation rental on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, available for the upcoming summer months. No reviews. Reasonable price. The owner, someone named Carson, mentioned it had been recently renovated after sitting vacant for years. I shouldn't have booked it. Something about the coincidence should have warned me, but I was too captivated by the mystery, too convinced it was some sort of sign. Maybe I was meant to find this place. I requested 2 weeks in July. Carson approved my stay within minutes. When I arrived at the property after a long drive from the nearest airport, the sun was already setting behind the trees. The cabin looked exactly like it had in my dreams. The blue shutters, the wraparound porch, the dock extending into the still waters of the lake. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu as I got out of my rental car, like I was stepping into my own dream. The key was under the mat, just as Carson had instructed in his email. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a living room with rustic furniture, a stone fireplace, and large windows facing the lake. Everything was clean, but carried a faint, musty smell, like places that sit empty too long. "Hello?" I called out, even though I knew no one would answer. My voice seemed to be swallowed by the walls. As I unpacked and settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd look over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway or peering through a window. But there was never anyone there, just shadows growing longer as the sun disappeared. That night, I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the chorus of frogs and crickets. The lake was completely still, a black mirror reflecting the stars and half-moon. The nearest neighbor's cabin was barely visible through the trees, at least half a mile away. I was utterly alone. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the dark woods surrounding the property, someone was watching me. I slept poorly that first night. The cabin made unfamiliar sounds, creaks and groans that startled me awake repeatedly. I told myself it was just an old building settling, but each noise seemed deliberate, like footsteps or someone dragging something across the floor upstairs. Around 3 a.m., I was jerked fully awake by the sound of an engine outside. I went to the window and saw headlights. A motorcycle had pulled up at the edge of the property. The rider sat there for almost 5 minutes, the bike idling, before finally turning around and heading back down the gravel road. Probably lost, I muttered to myself, but the incident left me uneasy. The next morning was bright and sunny, washing away my nighttime fears. I explored the property, finding a small boathouse that contained a dusty canoe and fishing gear. The lake was beautiful in the daylight, clear water revealing rocks and small fish near the shore. I spent hours on the dock, reading and dozing in the warm sun. While making dinner that evening, I noticed the photographs on the wall that I'd overlooked when I arrived. Most showed the cabin in different seasons, buried in snow, surrounded by fall foliage. But one photo caught my attention. A family standing on the dock, probably from the 1980s judging by their clothes. They were smiling, but something about their expressions seemed forced. I leaned closer and noticed that in the window of the cabin behind them, there appeared to be a face watching. Just a blur, really, but distinctly human-shaped. I was still studying the photo when every light in the cabin suddenly went out. "Great," I said, trying to ignore my pounding heart as I fumbled for my phone's flashlight. I found the circuit breaker in a utility closet and flipped the switches, but nothing happened. Power outage, then. As darkness fell outside, I lit the candles I found in a kitchen drawer and tried to stay calm. Without electricity, the silence was profound. No hum of the refrigerator or air conditioning, just the occasional creak of the house and distant sounds from the forest. I was reading by candlelight when I heard it, a soft scratching at the back door. At first, I thought it might be a branch or small animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. "Who's there?" I called out, immediately regretting giving away my location. The scratching stopped. Complete silence followed for nearly a minute. Then 3 distinct knocks. My throat went dry. I stood frozen, unsure what to do. Then I heard a child's laugh, brief and distant, gone almost before I registered it. I grabbed a kitchen knife and cautiously approached the back door, my heart thundering in my chest. The small window in the door revealed only darkness. I steeled myself and yanked the door open, knife raised. Nothing. The back porch was empty. The woods beyond were a wall of black. I quickly shut and locked the door, then checked every window and entrance to the cabin, securing each one. As I was checking the front door, the lights suddenly came back on, making me jump. The power had returned as unexpectedly as it had gone. That night, I slept with the knife on my bedside table. The next morning, I seriously considered leaving, but in the daylight, my fears seemed foolish. I decided to explore the nearby town, instead, hoping to learn more about the cabin's history. Lake Junction was a small tourist town about 15 minutes from the cabin by car. I found a local diner and struck up a conversation with the waitress, a woman in her 60s named Martha. "Pinewood Retreat," she repeated when I mentioned where I was staying. "That old place has been empty for years. Didn't know Carson was renting it out now." "Do you know the history of it?" I asked casually, sipping my coffee. Martha hesitated. "There was a family that owned it back in the 80s, the Wheelers. They were, well, they kept to themselves mostly." "Did something happen to them?" I pressed. "Finish your breakfast, honey," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Some stories aren't meant for telling to visitors." As I was paying my bill, an older man at the counter spoke without looking at me. "If you're staying at Wheeler Cabin, don't go in the boathouse after dark," he said quietly. "And whatever you hear at night, don't answer." Before I could ask what he meant, Martha shooed him away, giving me a tight smile. "Don't mind Frank. He likes to scare tourists with old ghost stories." I left the diner with more questions than answers. That afternoon, as I walked along the shore of the lake, I discovered a small path leading into the woods. Curious, I followed it for about 10 minutes until it opened into a clearing. In the center stood the crumbling stone foundation of what must have been another cabin, long ago burned or demolished. Among the weeds growing through the foundation, I spotted something metallic. I picked it up, a tarnished locket. Inside was a faded photograph of a young girl. I pocketed the locket, suddenly feeling like I was being watched again. The trees seemed to close in around the clearing, and the birds had gone silent. I hurried back to my cabin, unable to shake the sensation of eyes following my every move. By my 4th night at Pinewood Retreat, I'd almost convinced myself that my imagination was getting the better of me. The scratching at the door hadn't returned, and despite the occasional odd noise, nothing truly frightening had happened. I'd even begun to sleep better, lulled by the sounds of the lake lapping against the dock. That changed at exactly 2:17 a.m., when I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine. I rushed to the window and saw the same bike, from the first night, idling at the edge of my property. This time, the rider turned off the engine and dismounted. In the moonlight, I could make out a tall, thin figure in dark clothing. They stood motionless, facing the cabin for several long minutes. Then, they reached back to the bike and removed something long and thin, what looked like a crowbar or tire iron. My blood ran cold as the figure began walking slowly toward the cabin. I scrambled for my phone to call 911, but there was no signal, just as there hadn't been since I arrived. I'd been driving to town whenever I needed to make calls or check email. Panic rising, I grabbed the kitchen knife I'd kept nearby and retreated to the bathroom, the only room without windows. I locked the door and sat with my back against it, knife clutched in my shaking hands. Minutes passed like hours as I strained to hear any sound of entry. Eventually, I heard creaking, footsteps on the porch. Then the distinct sound of someone trying the front door handle. It was locked, thank God. The footsteps circled the house, trying each door and window. When they reached the back door, I heard a new sound, the scrape of metal against wood. They were trying to pry open the door. Suddenly, a loud crash from somewhere in the cabin, breaking glass. They were inside. I covered my mouth to stifle a scream, tears streaming down my face. The footsteps moved through the house slowly, deliberately. Drawers opening and closing, objects being moved. Then silence. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the front door open and close. I waited another 30 minutes before finding the courage to emerge from the bathroom. The cabin had been searched, drawers pulled open, items moved, but nothing seemed to be missing. The back window had been broken to gain entry. I spent the remainder of the night huddled on the bathroom floor, knife in hand, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I immediately drove to town to report the break-in to local police. The officer who took my statement seemed oddly unsurprised. "We get reports like this every few years from that property," he said, not looking up from his form. "Never find anyone, though." "What about the motorcycle? Someone broke in," I insisted. "We'll send someone out to take a look," he promised, but his tone suggested it was a formality. I called Carson, the owner, but got his voicemail. I left an angry message about the break-in and the cabin's obvious security issues. Then I went to the local hardware store and bought new locks, a hammer, nails, and plywood to cover the broken window. As I was checking out, the cashier studied my face. "Staying at the Wheeler place, aren't you?" she asked quietly. "How did you know?" "You've got that look. Everyone who stays there gets it eventually." She leaned closer. "My sister cleaned for the Wheelers back then, before it happened." "Before what happened?" I demanded. She glanced around, then whispered, "The girl went missing first. Lily, their daughter. Then Mrs. Wheeler disappeared a week later. Mr. Wheeler said they'd gone to stay with family, but..." She made a slashing motion across her throat. 2 months later, he was found in the boathouse. Hung himself. My stomach dropped as I remembered the locket I'd found with the girl's picture. "The daughter?" I asked. "Did they ever find her?" The cashier shook her head. "Some say she still wanders the woods at night, looking for her mama." Back at the cabin, I reinforced the broken window and changed the locks. As I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about the locket in my pocket. Was it possible it had belonged to Lily Wheeler? And if so, why had I found it in those ruins in the woods? That evening, I decided to investigate the boathouse that the man at the diner had warned me about. In the fading daylight, it seemed harmless enough. Just a weathered wooden structure containing the canoe I'd seen earlier, and some old fishing equipment. But as I explored further, I noticed something odd. Scratch marks on the inside of the door, as if someone had been locked inside and tried to claw their way out. And on the back wall, partially hidden behind a stack of life vests, was a small door I hadn't noticed before. It took some effort to move the heavy vests, but eventually I cleared a path to the door. It was padlocked shut. I found a rusty crowbar, hanging on the wall, and after a moment's hesitation, used it to break the lock. The door opened to reveal a small, dark space, barely bigger than a closet. The smell that wafted out was awful, a combination of mildew, rot, and something else I couldn't identify. I used my phone's flashlight to illuminate the space. The walls were covered in childish drawings, stick figures of a family, a house, a lake. But as the drawings continued around the room, They became disturbing. Dark figures with no faces, a house with flames, a girl underwater. In the center of the floor was a small pile of children's clothes, rotted and moldy with age. Backed out of the space, my heart racing. As I turned to leave the boathouse, the door slammed shut. I ran to it and pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Something was holding it closed from the outside. "Hey!" I shouted, pounding on the door. "Let me out!" No response, but I could sense someone on the other side. I continued pounding and shouting for what felt like hours until my hands were bruised and my voice hoarse. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm me, I heard the sound of a motorcycle engine starting nearby. Minutes later, the door suddenly swung open. I stumbled out onto the dock, gasping for fresh air. Night had fallen completely, and the moon reflected on the still waters of the lake. There was no one in sight, but I could hear the motorcycle engine fading in the distance. As I hurried back to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Wet footprints on the dock leading from the lake to the boathouse. They hadn't been there when I entered. I ran the rest of the way to the cabin, locked myself inside, and pushed a heavy bookcase in front of the door. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak, every gust of wind sounded like someone trying to get in. Around midnight, my phone chimed with a text message, startling me. Somehow I had service, which hadn't happened once since arriving. The message was from an unknown number. "She's still in the lake. Leave before they come back." As I stared at the message in horror, the lights in the cabin began to flicker. In the brief moments of darkness between flashes, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, the silhouette of a small girl, dripping wet. Then the lights went out completely. In the pitch darkness, I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I dropped it twice. When I finally activated the flashlight, the beam swept across the room. Empty. No small girl, no dripping figure. Just shadows and furniture. "Get it. Together," I whispered to myself, trying to slow my racing heart. I needed to leave, to get to my car and drive away from this nightmare. But my rental car was parked outside, and between me and it was whatever was out there. As if responding to my thoughts, I heard the distinct sound of motorcycle engines, plural this time, approaching the cabin. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw headlights cutting through the darkness. 2 bikes pulled up in front of the cabin. 2 riders dismounted. In the harsh glare of their headlights, I could see they both carried something. One had what looked like a hunting knife, the other a machete or large blade. They stood talking for a moment, their voices too low to make out, then began walking toward the cabin. Panic surged through me. I ran upstairs, looking for a place to hide or an alternate way out. The second-floor windows were too high to jump safely, and there was no fire escape. I was trapped. From downstairs came the sound of someone trying the front door, finding it. Locked. Then heavy pounding, wood splintering. "We know you're in there," a man's voice called out. "Open up. We just want to talk." The pounding continued, growing more violent. I retreated to the master bedroom and locked the door, then dragged the heavy dresser in front of it. I crouched in the corner, knife in hand, trying to control my breathing. The sound of the front door giving way echoed through the cabin, followed by heavy footsteps. "Check upstairs," one voice commanded. Footsteps on the stairs, a testing of my bedroom door handle. "This one's locked," the voice called down. "Break it down." As they began ramming the bedroom door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small door, almost like a crawl space, built into the wall near the floor. With no other options, I pulled it open and squeezed inside just as the bedroom door began to splinter. The crawl space was tight and dusty, leading somewhere into the walls of the house. I pulled the small door closed behind me and crawled forward in total darkness, cobwebs clinging to my face and arms. Behind me, I heard the bedroom door crash open, followed by cursing as they discovered I wasn't there. The narrow passage turned and descended, and I realized I was following a route between the walls of the cabin, possibly an old servant's passage or hidden access route. After several claustrophobic minutes, the passage ended at another small door. I hesitated, listening. I could hear the men tearing apart the cabin above me, but no sounds from beyond this door. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. I found myself in what appeared to be a hidden basement room, a space I hadn't known existed. Unlike the rest of the modernized cabin, this room looked untouched for decades. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, somehow still working despite the power outage. Upstairs, the walls were lined with old photographs, hundreds of them. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized with growing horror what I was seeing. They were surveillance photos of families, vacationers, all at different times but in the same location, this cabin. And in many photos, the subjects were sleeping, unaware they were being photographed. In the center of the room stood an old desk covered in notebooks. I opened one with trembling hands. It contained meticulous records, names, dates, items collected. On one wall hung various personal belongings, watches, jewelry, wallets, trophies taken from previous victims. And there, among them, was a familiar-looking locket, identical to the one I'd found in the ruins. A noise from above snapped me back to my immediate danger. The men were still searching for me. I needed to find a way out. At the far end of the room was a heavy door, with a deadbolt. I slid it open as quietly as possible and found myself looking at a narrow underground tunnel, shored up with wooden beams, leading away from the cabin. With no other choice, I entered the tunnel, using my phone's dimming flashlight to navigate. The air was damp and cold, the passage barely tall enough to crouch in. After what felt like forever, I saw a faint light ahead. The tunnel emerged inside the ruined foundation I'd discovered in the woods, the remains of another cabin. Now, I understood. This had been part of an elaborate system, a way for someone to move between properties unseen. As I climbed out of the tunnel into the night air, I heard shouts in the distance. They'd discovered my escape route. I had minutes at most. I ran blindly. Through the woods, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, flashlight beams cut through the trees as my pursuers gave chase. I had no plan beyond putting distance between us. My only hope was to reach the main road and flag down a passing car. But in the darkness, I quickly became disoriented. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. I stumbled into a clearing and froze. Before me stood the boathouse, its silhouette unmistakable against the night sky. Somehow, I'd run in a circle, back to the lake. With nowhere else to go, I ducked inside, the boathouse. As my eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness, I made out a small figure standing by the water's edge inside the structure. A girl, perhaps 12 years old, in a dress that might once have been white, but was now stained dark. Her hair hung in wet ropes around her pale face. She was holding something, the locket I'd found in the woods. "Lily?" I whispered. She didn't speak, but raised one hand and pointed toward the water lapping at the boards of the boathouse. Outside, voices approached. The men had tracked me here. "Please," I begged the girl. "Help me." She continued pointing at the water, more insistently now. With the sound of footsteps on the dock outside, I made a desperate decision. I slipped into the black water as quietly as possible, clinging to the edge of the boathouse platform. The door burst open. Flashlight beams swept the interior. "Nothing," one man said. "Check the cabin again. He can't have gotten far." As their footsteps retreated, I started to pull myself out of the water. That's when I felt something brush against my leg. Something solid. In the faint moonlight filtering through the boathouse windows, I saw a pale hand reach up from the depths and close around my ankle. I would have screamed if another hand, the girl's, hadn't clamped over my mouth from above. She leaned down, her face inches from mine, water dripping from her hair onto my face. "Mom's been waiting for company," she whispered. More hands emerged from the water, grabbing at my clothes, my limbs, pulling me downward. I thrashed and fought, but they were impossibly strong. As my head went under, the last thing I saw was the girl's face, watching expressionlessly as I was dragged into the depths. In my final moments of consciousness, as water filled my lungs, I understood. The Wheeler family had never left. Mr. Wheeler hadn't been the monster, he'd been another victim, driven to suicide by what he'd discovered. The real predators were something else entirely, something that had been using this property, these woods, this lake, as hunting grounds for decades. And now I was joining their collection. I shouldn't be alive to tell this story. As the water closed over my head and those pale hands pulled me deeper into the lake, I was certain death had come for me. My lungs burned, my vision darkened at the edges, and the cold penetrated to my bones. Then, suddenly, the hands released me. Through the murky water, I saw them, the woman and the girl, floating before me, their hair swaying like seaweed in the current. They weren't trying to drown me. They were showing me something. The woman pointed downward to the bottom of the lake. There, partially buried in the silt, I could make out shapes. Human shapes. Bodies preserved by the cold water. Dozens of them. Generations of victims. With my remaining strength, I kicked toward the surface, broke through gasping and choking. I dragged myself onto the boathouse dock, vomiting lake water, shivering uncontrollably. When I looked back at the water, they were there. The woman and girl, their heads and shoulders above the surface, watching me silently. Then, as one, they raised their arms and pointed toward the woods behind the cabin. Despite my exhaustion and terror, I understood. I staggered to my feet and ran, not toward the road as I'd planned before, but following their direction, deeper into the property. Behind me, I heard the motorcycle engines again. The men had returned. I stumbled through the trees, guided only by instinct and the fading beam of my waterlogged phone. After several minutes, I came upon a small clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center stood an old, rusted pickup truck, covered in years of fallen leaves and pine needles. The keys were in the ignition. I brushed away the debris, slid behind the wheel and turned the key, expecting nothing. To my shock, the engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow, overgrown path that I hadn't noticed before. An old service road leading away from the property. As I accelerated down the rough track, my headlights swept across a figure standing at the edge of the trees. The girl, Lily. She raised her hand in what might have been a wave or a warning. Then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the state police barracks 2 counties over. I told them everything. The break-in, the chase, the hidden room with its grisly trophies. I left out only the impossible parts, the things no rational person would believe. They were skeptical until I showed them the notebook I'd grabbed. From the hidden room, the one containing dates, names, items collected. Names that, as they soon discovered, matched missing persons reports going back decades. The investigation that followed revealed the terrible truth. The property had been used by a family of killers for generations. Not the Wheelers, who had indeed been victims themselves, but the Carsons. My host Carson was the latest in a line of predators who used the remote cabin to lure in guests, rob them, kill them, and dispose of their bodies in the deep lake. The 2 men who had chased me were identified as brothers, the last of the Carson family. They were captured 3 days later as they tried to flee the state. In their possession were items stolen from a dozen previous victims. When police searched the property, they found the hidden basement room just as I described it. They found the tunnel leading to the ruined foundation in the woods. They even found the old pickup truck, exactly where I'd left it when it finally broke down miles from the cabin. But they never found any bodies in the lake. Despite multiple dives with sonar equipment, the bottom of the lake revealed nothing but mud and rocks. The case made national headlines. Vacation rental killers, the tabloids called them. I was hailed as the one who got away, the survivor who brought down a murderous legacy. But I know the truth is more complicated. Sometimes I dream of the lake. In the dreams, I'm underwater again, but I can breathe, can see clearly. Lily and her mother are there, floating among dozens of others. Men, women, children of all ages. The victims. They're not at rest, but they're not suffering either. They're waiting. When the authorities asked if I would return to identify evidence or particular locations on the property, I refused. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some debts can never be repaid. I received a letter last week, forwarded by the police. Inside was the locket I'd found in the woods, the one I'd last seen in Lily's hand. With it was a note in childish handwriting. They'll come back, they always do. I've moved 3 times since then, changed my name, cut ties with my former life. But I still check the locks twice each night. I still wake up at 2:17 a.m., hearing a motorcycle engine that isn't there. And sometimes when I wake, my sheets are damp. Not with sweat, but with lake water that smells of weeds and secrets long buried. I know the truth now. The Carsons weren't working alone all those years. They had help, ancient help, from something that lives in the lake. Something that made a deal generations ago, trading protection and prey for regular sacrifices. I was supposed to be the next offering. Instead, I became something else. A messenger, perhaps. Or a warning. Don't follow your dreams to places you don't understand. Don't trust coincidences that seem too perfect. And if you're ever browsing vacation rentals online and come across a beautiful lakeside cabin with blue shutters and a private dock on Lake Winnipesaukee, scrolling past the perfect pictures of sunset views and cozy interiors, remember my story. Some dreams are better left in darkness, some places are hungry, and the vacancy sign is always lit.